The screen flickers with images of towering oil rigs piercing the horizon, flames dancing from flare stacks against a blood-orange sky. Cut to a firm handshake. President Ibrahim Traoré and India's energy minister, flanked by flags, cameras flashing like lightning. Then silence. A Western news anchor stares into the lens, visibly shaken. In a single stroke, she says, voice tight with disbelief, Traoré rewrote the rules of global power, and the West never saw it coming. The cheer blazes. $15 billion oil deal signed between Burkina Faso and India. The studio falls quiet. Analysts scramble papers. One mutters, "This changes everything." Cut to a map. West Africa glowing red, India pulsing gold. Arrows surge between them. Not pipelines, but power lines. A new axis forming. The anchor continues. For decades, the West treated African oil as its birthright. But Traoré just flipped the script and chose a partner that didn't come with strings. Footage rolls. Western diplomats exiting a summit, faces pale. A leaked memo flashes on screen. Urgent, reassess Burkina Faso strategy. The voiceover cuts in. Washington didn't just lose a deal. It lost control. Then, Traoré's voice, calm, resolute, echoes from the press conference. "We are not here to be managed. We are here to lead." The montage ends with a crowd in Ouagadougou cheering, waving flags, chanting his name. A young woman holds a sign. Africa chooses its future. And just as the viewer begins to process the magnitude of the moment, the narrator drops the line. But this wasn't just a business deal. It was a geopolitical earthquake. Burkina Faso had long been dismissed as a footnote in the global energy conversation, a landlocked nation, rich in resources, but shackled by foreign interests. Beneath its soil lay untapped oil reserves, quietly surveyed for decades by Western firms who saw Africa not as a partner, but as a prize. They came with contracts written in fine print, promises wrapped in debt, and a legacy of extraction that left communities hollowed out and leaders compromised. But Traoré was not that kind of leader. India, meanwhile, was surging, its population booming, its economy hungry, and its energy demands skyrocketing. For years, it had danced around the edges of OPEC, seeking alternatives that didn't come with geopolitical strings. What it needed wasn't just oil, it needed a new kind of alliance. One built not on dominance, but on dignity. And that's where the story turned. Traoré saw in India a mirror, a post-colonial powerhouse that had carved its own path, defied expectations, and refused to be defined by Western narratives. When the two sides met, it wasn't just a negotiation, it was a declaration. No middlemen, no IMF oversight, no Western observers in the room. Just two sovereign nations, speaking as equals. The deal was bold. $15 billion in infrastructure, technology transfer, and long-term energy cooperation. But more than the numbers, it was the symbolism that set the world ablaze. For the first time, Burkina Faso wasn't being told what it could offer. It was deciding what it deserved. Western capitals were stunned. Analysts called it reckless. Editorials warned of instability. But on the streets of Ouagadougou, people danced. They saw something the West couldn't, a leader who had broken the cycle. And then came the twist. Because the real shock wasn't just the deal itself, it was who Traoré had deliberately left out of the negotiations. For decades, the story of African oil was written in boardrooms thousands of miles away. Western conglomerates, names like PetroGlobal, Atlantic Core, and Dominion Energy, had mastered the art of extraction without accountability. They arrived with glossy brochures and ironclad contracts, promising development while siphoning billions in crude from beneath African soil. Burkina Faso, though not yet a major producer, had long been on their radar. Its untapped reserves were quietly cataloged, its leaders quietly courted, and its sovereignty quietly undermined. These corporations didn't operate alone. Behind them stood a network of Western diplomats, intelligence operatives, and policy architects who viewed Africa not as a continent of equals, but as a chessboard. Washington's Africa desk had one guiding principle: maintain access, suppress alternatives. Brussels echoed the same strategy, cloaked in the language of stability and partnership, while ensuring European firms retained their grip. Traoré's rise disrupted everything. He wasn't groomed by Western institutions. He didn't owe favors to foreign donors. He came from the barracks, not the banquet halls. And when he began consolidating power, the West grew nervous. They sent envoys with smiles and spreadsheets. They offered technical assistance, security cooperation, and investment packages. But Traoré didn't flinch. Instead, he asked the questions they'd spent decades avoiding. Why were Western firms still paying pennies on the barrel while profits soared in London and Houston? Why were environmental protections enforced in Europe but waived in Africa? Why were local communities still waiting for the clinics and schools promised in every glossy pitch deck? The silence was telling, so they pivoted. Pressure replaced persuasion. A leaked memo from a U.S. Energy Task Force read, "Traoré must be reminded of the consequences of isolation." Another from Brussels warned, "India's growing footprint in West Africa poses a strategic threat. Burkina Faso must be re-engaged immediately." They tried economic threats, hinting at aid cuts, trade reviews, and investment freezes. They floated rumors of instability, hoping to rattle investors. They even attempted to stir internal dissent, funding think tanks and media outlets to question Traoré's legitimacy. But Traoré wasn't just resisting, he was rewriting the rules. He began auditing foreign contracts. He demanded transparency. He invited African economists, not Western consultants, to draft his energy policy. And most provocatively, he refused to renew PetroGlobal's exploration license, a move that sent shockwaves through Wall Street. Western capitals panicked. Emergency meetings were called. Reports were drafted. One internal EU briefing read, "Traoré's unpredictability is destabilizing the region's energy architecture." But it wasn't unpredictability, it was independence. And then came the final insult. When news of the $15 billion deal with India broke, Western officials scrambled to understand how they'd been blindsided. No leaks, no whispers, no access. They had been locked out deliberately. Because Traoré hadn't just signed a deal. He had sent a message. And just when they thought they could strong-arm Traoré into submission, he did something no African leader had dared before. Ibrahim Traoré was born in a land still haunted by the echo of colonial boots. His earliest memories weren't of playgrounds or parades. They were of ration lines, of elders whispering about promises broken, of textbooks that praised foreign rulers more than local heroes. He grew up watching his parents navigate a system designed to keep them small. But even as a boy, Traoré refused to shrink. He joined the military not for power, but for purpose. In the barracks, he found discipline. In the field, he found truth. He rose quickly, not because he played politics, but because he didn't. His loyalty was never to the generals who dined with diplomats, but to the soldiers who shared bread in silence. He listened, he learned, and he never forgot where he came from. But the betrayal came early. As he climbed the ranks, Traoré saw how the elite operated. Politicians who spoke of reform while signing away mineral rights. Businessmen who toasted to progress while funneling profits offshore. Foreign advisors who smiled in public and schemed in private. He watched his country's future traded for short-term gains and foreign applause. And he snapped, not with rage, but with resolve. Traoré began speaking out, quietly at first, then boldly. He called for audits. He demanded transparency. He refused to rubber-stamp deals that didn't serve the people. And when the establishment tried to sideline him, the people pulled him forward. His rise wasn't orchestrated, it was organic. From the markets of Ouagadougou to the villages of Bobo Dioulasso, whispers turned into chants. Traoré speaks for us. Traoré fights for us. He became a symbol, not of rebellion, but of reclamation. When he took power, he didn't arrive with vengeance. He arrived with vision. He spoke of African autonomy, not as a slogan, but as a strategy. He invested in local engineers. He restructured education to teach African history with pride. He met with farmers before financiers. And when foreign powers tried to corner him, he didn't lash out. He simply stepped around them. Calm, strategic, unshakable. Traoré didn't seek confrontation, but he never fled from it. He understood the stakes. He knew the cost of silence. And he believed that dignity wasn't negotiable. So when the West began its pressure campaign, when the threats, the rumors, the economic games began, Traoré didn't blink. Because he'd seen this playbook before. He'd lived it. And he'd prepared for it. And that's what made him uniquely prepared for the moment the West tried to retaliate. The room was cold, not from the air conditioning, but from the tension that hung like fog. A closed-door summit in Geneva, meant to be discreet, had become a battlefield of glances and veiled threats. Western diplomats sat stiffly across from Traoré, their expressions tight, their voices sharpened by frustration. "You've destabilized the region," barked the French delegate, his accent slicing through the silence. "This deal with India, it undermines decades of cooperation." Traoré didn't flinch. The American envoy leaned forward, voice low but loaded. "You've jeopardized strategic interests. There will be consequences. Sanctions, trade freezes, isolation." Still, Traoré remained calm. His eyes scanned the room, not with fear, but with quiet calculation. The British representative chimed in, more theatrical than the rest. "You've invited chaos. The media's already calling it reckless. You're being portrayed as a rogue actor." Traoré raised an eyebrow. "By whose media?" The question landed like a slap. Screens lit up around the room. Graphs, headlines, leaked reports. Western outlets had begun a smear campaign, painting Traoré as erratic, dangerous, a threat to global stability. One headline read, "Burkina Faso's gamble could ignite energy crisis." Another, "India's risky bet on an unpredictable partner." But Traoré didn't defend. He didn't explain. He simply waited. The tension escalated. Voices rose. Accusations flew. One diplomat even suggested that Traoré's government might face internal challenges if it continued down this path. That was the moment the room shifted. Traoré leaned forward, his voice steady, deliberate. "You speak of destabilization. But who destabilized us first? Who drew borders that split tribes, signed contracts that silenced communities, and funded leaders who sold our futures?" Silence. He continued, "You call this chaos. I call it correction." The Western delegation was visibly rattled. Papers shuffled. Eyes darted. The American envoy whispered something to his aide, who quickly exited the room. Traoré stood, slowly. "We are not here to be managed. We are not here to be warned. We are here because we choose to be." And then, just as the diplomats began to regroup, just as they thought the confrontation had peaked, Traoré wasn't done. What he said next turned the entire room upside down. Traoré stood at the center of the summit room, the silence around him thick with tension. The Western delegates had thrown everything they had, threats, accusations, veiled warnings, but he hadn't flinched. Now it was his turn. He began slowly, his voice calm, deliberate. "Let me remind you," he said, "that the first oil contract signed in this region was not a partnership, it was a plunder." A murmur rippled through the room. "For decades," Traoré continued, "you've extracted our wealth, dictated our terms, and called it cooperation. You built empires on our resources, and when we asked for fairness, you offered lectures. When we asked for dignity, you offered debt." He turned toward the American envoy. "Your companies made $42 billion in profit from African oil last year. Burkina Faso received less than 0.5% of that. And yet, you call us destabilizing." Gasps. A few heads turned toward the screens behind him, where a slide now displayed the numbers. Clear, damning, irrefutable. Traoré didn't pause. "You speak of transparency. But where was transparency when PetroGlobal dumped toxic waste near our villages and paid a $3 million fine for a $300 million disaster?" The French delegate shifted uncomfortably. "You speak of democracy," Traoré said, eyes narrowing. "But you funded regimes that silenced our people. You trained leaders who sold our futures. You wrote our constitutions, then punished us when we rewrote them." He turned to the British representative. "Your media calls me unpredictable. But what's unpredictable is your outrage. You were silent when we were exploited. You were silent when we were poisoned. You were silent when our children died digging minerals for your phones." The room was frozen. Traoré's voice softened, but his words cut deeper. "India came to us not with demands, but with respect. They offered engineers, not enforcers. They asked what we needed, not what we could give. That is partnership." The Indian delegation nodded, visibly moved. "And let me be clear," Traoré said, "this deal is not just about oil. It's about rewriting the narrative. It's about saying, we are not pawns. We are not pipelines. We are not your contingency plan." He stepped forward. "We are the authors of our own future." A pause. Then, from the back of the room, a slow clap. One delegate from Ghana stood, followed by another from Senegal. The ripple spread. Applause broke out. Not thunderous, but firm, defiant. The Western reps looked stunned. Red-faced. Exposed. Traoré turned toward the cameras. Let the world hear this. Africa is not waiting for permission. Africa is not asking for approval. Africa is rising. The feed cut to social media. Clips of the speech exploded across platforms. TikTok edits layered his words over triumphant music. Twitter lit up with quotes, reactions, and memes. One post read, "Traoré just did what every African leader dreams of." Another, "This is our Sankara moment." And then, the hashtag appeared. Simple, bold, unignorable. Africa rises. And as the world watched, a new hashtag began trending. Hashtag Africa rises. The ink on the $15 billion deal had barely dried when the ripple effects began to surge across continents. In New Delhi, news anchors spoke with visible pride, calling the agreement a landmark moment in South-South cooperation. Editorials praised Traoré's courage, framing him as a visionary who had broken the mold of post-colonial dependency. One headline read, "Burkina Faso finds its voice, and India listens." But it was in Africa where the emotional resonance truly exploded. Across the continent, youth took to social media with a fervor rarely seen in diplomatic affairs. TikTok lit up with edits of Traoré's speech, layered over Afrobeat anthems and cinematic slow-motion clips. One viral video showed his calm rebuttal to Western threats, captioned, "This is what leadership looks like." Twitter threads dissected his words line by line, drawing parallels to Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, and other icons of African resistance. In Ouagadougou, murals of Traoré began appearing overnight. A local artist painted him standing tall beside a lion, with the words, "We choose our future." University students organized teach-ins on energy sovereignty, quoting Traoré's speech like scripture. WhatsApp groups buzzed with pride, memes, and plans for grassroots mobilization. Western media, caught off guard, scrambled to reframe the narrative. Some outlets tried to downplay the deal, calling it symbolic or risky. Others pivoted, suddenly praising Traoré's boldness while subtly questioning India's motives. But the damage was done. The old narrative of Africa as a passive player had shattered. Celebrities joined the chorus. A Nigerian pop star tweeted, "Traoré just gave us a masterclass in dignity." A South African filmmaker announced a documentary titled "The Deal That Shook the West." Even diaspora voices in London and New York began organizing panels and podcasts, eager to unpack the moment. And then came the unexpected. As the world watched Africa rise, an unlikely voice entered the conversation. Not from a neighboring country, not from a traditional ally, but from within the very halls Traoré had just defied. But the biggest surprise came from an unexpected ally, one that could change everything again. The summit was over, but the echoes of Traoré's words continued to reverberate far beyond the walls of Geneva. What had begun as a negotiation over oil had transformed into a global reckoning. Commentators scrambled to keep up, but the truth was clear. This wasn't just a deal. It was a declaration. Traoré stood before the press, flanked by his delegation and India's energy ministers. Cameras flashed, microphones clustered, and the world leaned in. He didn't speak with bravado. He spoke with clarity. "We are not pawns," he said, voice steady. "We are partners." It was more than a soundbite. It was a philosophy, a reframing of Africa's place in the world, not as a resource pool, not as a battleground for foreign influence, but as a sovereign force with its own vision, its own voice, and its own value. India's spokesperson echoed the sentiment. "This is the future," she said. "Mutual respect, shared growth, dignity in diplomacy." The message resonated. Across continents, people began to see the moment for what it truly was, a rupture in the old order. For too long, global hierarchies had been built on silence, on the assumption that some voices mattered more than others, that some nations were destined to follow while others led. But Traoré had flipped the script. He didn't just challenge the West's dominance. He challenged the very idea that power must come at the expense of principle. His actions reminded the world that justice isn't a Western export. It's a universal demand. That independence isn't a luxury, it's a right. That unity isn't weakness, it's strength. In classrooms across Africa, teachers began referencing the deal as a case study in sovereignty. In diaspora communities, parents told their children, "This is what leadership looks like." And in policy circles from Jakarta to Johannesburg, the phrase Traore doctrine began to surface, a shorthand for bold, values-driven diplomacy. But the impact wasn't just political. It was personal. Young Africans saw themselves in Traore, not as victims of history, but as authors of the future. Immigrant communities in Europe and North America felt a surge of pride, a validation of identity that had long been denied. And progressive voices around the world found in Traore a symbol of what global leadership could be: principled, inclusive, and unapologetically transformative. The West, meanwhile, was forced to reckon with its own contradictions. Editorials shifted tone. Think tanks revised forecasts. Even former critics began to acknowledge that something fundamental had changed. Because Traore hadn't just made a deal. He'd made a statement. And that statement was being heard. In the days that followed, new partnerships began to form. African nations reached out to one another, exploring regional energy alliances. India announced scholarship programs for African engineers. And social media continued to pulse with energy, with one post capturing the mood perfectly. We're not just watching history. We're rewriting it. And if this moment teaches us anything, it's that the world is finally listening to voices it once ignored. Traore's $15 billion oil deal with India wasn't just a shock to the West. It was a seismic shift in how global power is defined. It wasn't about crude barrels or trade routes. It was about dignity, about sovereignty, about a leader who refused to play by the old rules and instead wrote his own. This moment wasn't scripted by think tanks or sanctioned by foreign capitals. It was authored by a man who stood tall, spoke truth, and reminded the world that Africa is not a shadow, it's a force. And now, the ripple is yours. If you believe in rewriting the rules, if you believe that partnership should replace exploitation, if you believe that voices long silenced deserve to be heard loud and clear, then hit subscribe. Share this story. Be part of the movement. Because this isn't just Traore's victory, it's a blueprint for every nation, every community, every individual who's ever been told to wait their turn. The world is watching. The narrative is shifting. And the next chapter is being written right now. By you. By us. Together. Africa Rises isn't just a hashtag, it's a heartbeat. And it's only getting louder.